Hi, guys. Before we get started today, I just want to leave a little note. It is very hard to pronounce some of the names of the gods and the people and the places and the cities here, okay? I promise you, I try my best to look up all the pronunciations and things like that and try and, read it out phonetically and, do the, Google speech and there's YouTube things with, this is how you say it. I try my absolute best, but it is hard. So if we can just all know what I'm talking about and glaze over the pronunciations pretty please, you'd all make my day. All right? Let's get into it. Hi guys, and welcome back to Hot History, your corner of the internet where we cover all the things in history that you probably should know but don't. I'm Ainslie Harvey, your hot historian here, ready to chat today about probably the single most contentious conflict in history. I mean, is it real? Is it allegory? Is there evidence? And should we trust all recorded history? We are going to answer all of those questions and so much more in this episode on the Trojan War, guys. I have come with my little Grecian braids in, so we are going to dive straight into it and rewind all the way back to the late Mycenaean period, somewhere around 1250 BCE. Now, at this point in time, we're at the end of the late Bronze Age, which matters here because this was a moment of real cataclysmic change, guys. Historian and author Brett Devereaux describes this period as an end of civilization event, marked by a series of destructions by both man and nature, with the clashing of states throughout the Mediterranean leading to serious political and social chasms, which ultimately then plunged those who survived into the Dark Ages, aka the time where once mighty kingdoms, languages, and technologies fell. So the Trojan War is happening right in this period of great change and disaster. It's this real kind of melting point for just shit to go down. So what's the beef then? Right? You hear so much about the Trojan War, you hear Helen, what's all this mean? Was it real? Who's involved? And why are there condoms named after it? Well, guys, it begins with, at least according to man, where all things start, a woman. Well, actually, to be honest, 3 goddesses, and if you really do get into it, it actually starts with the laziness of one man god. But alas, I get ahead of myself. So let's begin first. We're going to set the scene, okay? We are sending ourselves back to ancient Greece. And at this particular moment, you're actually at a wedding. And more than that, you are at a wedding of a mortal king named Peleus and the powerful sea nymph Thetis, who were arranged in marriage by none other than the god king of Olympus himself, Zeus. If you remember from last week, Thetis is the sea goddess and Peleus, as we said, was a mortal, and because of this, she's pretty pissed about the marriage. And I mean, you can see why, right? She's this super powerful deity in her own right who could shapeshift and do all this cool stuff, and he's just a guy. So this is not a love match, and it actually came about because Zeus and Poseidon were both fighting to be with Thetis, but when they found out about a prophecy which revealed her own son would take down his father, Zeus married her off to this mortal man, right? Better him than Zeus. But back to the wedding. So this is a proper festivity with all of the Olympian gods present except for Eris, the primordial goddess of discord, who was not invited. So Eris gatecrashes this wedding, and she sneaks in with a golden apple, aka the fruit of temptation, which she throws down onto the banquet table. Now, you may be thinking, an apple? Really? You're so petty to show up after not being invited, and then your big show is to present an apple rather than flipping a table or, swilling someone Geordie Shore style. To which I say, totally agree, divas, you need to up the drama, but Eris isn't that stupid. You see, when the gods examined the apple, they found it contained an inscription, Callisti, which means to the fairest. So instantly, Aphrodite, goddess of love, stands up and goes, I'm Aphrodite, I'm so hot, of course it's for me. After which Hera, queen of Olympus, who, let's be real, guys, we're all still scared of her from last week, goes, well, guys, I'm the queen. So, like, obviously it's for me. After which Athena stands up and goes, yeah, you may be hot and, you may be queen, but I'm smart and brave, so obviously it's mine. Which leads to a scene that almost shot by shot mirrors the Tyra Banks versus Hannah Montana shoe showdown in the Hannah Montana movie. Real ones, no. Now, seeing this, Zeus, who is meant to be, the guy who keeps all the other Olympians in line, is like, oh, fucking hell, like eye roll, classic women, fighting over who's the best, because, of course, that's all we do, just frivolous ladies. And he doesn't want a bar of it. So instead of sorting it out himself and actually doing his job, he goes over to the messenger god Hermes. He goes, come here. And he tells him to take these three goddesses down to Paris, the prince of Troy, a mortal, who will settle the debate once and for all. Now, everyone in this story must have been Libras, because once they appeared in front of Paris, even he couldn't decide who should get the apple. So the goddesses then decide to basically have like a competition, right? A version of Shark Tank. Who can pitch Paris the best offer? Again, remember, we said last week, ancient Greek religion is dependent on, reciprocity, this idea of giving and receiving. So what do these goddesses have to offer the young Paris? Well, Athena goes first, offering him wisdom and victory in battle. Could be very useful. Next, Hera offers him power. Who doesn't want that? And lastly, Aphrodite offers him the most beautiful woman in the world. Which, Paris, of course, being a typical man, he picks the hot lady. So then who is this most fabulous, fabled fair maiden then? Well, it turns out her name was Helen. Regarded as the biological child of Zeus and Leda, she was raised on Earth as one of the daughters of Tyndareus, the Spartan king. Now, when we say she was the most beautiful woman on Earth here, guys, this is not hyperbole. Tales of Helen's beauty have spanned the centuries, reaching far and wide throughout her youth, something which Tyndareus became increasingly paranoid about. For her line of potential suitors, most of whom were some of the most powerful men in Greece, was never ending. Because of this, choosing Helen's match felt like an impossible decision for him. After all, like this is genuinely justified, right? If one of the suitors, like he rejects him, he goes, no, like Helen's not marrying you, and he has this huge fuck-off army, what's to then stop that guy invading Sparta or the state where Helen eventually becomes queen and just stealing her? Which, again, this is all justified. It did actually happen to Helen when she was 10 years old. She was like stolen as someone's bride, and, we don't have time for that. I can definitely do an episode for you guys on Helen of Troy, but another time. We're trying to like keep it surmised today on the war. But fear not, my divas, for this testosterone surging conundrum had a savior, and his name was Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, who ruled over one of the island states in the Ionian Sea. Now, he proposed that all Helen's suitors should swear an oath to defend both her marriage and, by extension, her husband, regardless of who, and wait for the real shocker here, guys, Helen herself chose to marry. Yeah, that's right. Helen actually did have a say, unlike, most women always and forever, in who she married. And despite Odysseus's, fabulous solution here, she did not choose him. Instead, selecting Menelaus, brother of Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae and commander-in-chief of the Greek forces. So a very, political savvy choice from Helen. And one which made Menelaus the king of Sparta, as Tyndareus abdicated after the marriage. Described as war-loving, he was not a man who liked to share, something which became very, very evident when Helen vanished into the night. Yes, you see, Aphrodite definitely held up her end of the bargain with Prince Paris of Troy, who snuck into Sparta to find Helen, and in no uncertain terms here, guys, abduct her. Now, if we listened to last week's episode about Hades and Persephone, it is a very similar situation, except in Helen's case, Aphrodite gets Eros, the god of love, desire, and sexual passion, to shoot Helen with an arrow, which makes her fall in love with Paris at first sight. So basically, Helen was roofied by an ancient god and goddess who promised her to another man, even though she's married and fully settled in Sparta, based on a choice she made herself. It is so fucked up and reinforced the fact that the Trojan War, right, and all the stories around it, which we'll get to sussing out the sources of that in a minute, are just deeply, deeply misogynistic, right? Like, the very epicenter of this tale is the idea that Helen leaves the evil Menelaus, which, you know what, I'm sure by all accounts, he was. But she does so for love, willingly, and with not only an understanding of the cataclysmic scale of the fallout from her actions, but a willingness to let all these men lose their lives for her. But that is just fucking horse shit. In this tale, Helen is depicted as this very, beautiful but super dumb woman, and that is just not the case. Honestly, again, I know I bring her up every episode, but it's like blaming Marie Antoinette for France's economic woes pre-revolution, as though she's looking over the state balance books and walking in and out of the treasury. It's so obviously laced with prejudice and, again, just downright false. But, I digress. Let's get back to it. Helen is shot by Eros, and as a result, is, roofied. She's in love with Paris, who takes her to his home, which is when Helen of Sparta becomes Helen of Troy. By which point, Menelaus, has figured out his wife is gone and throws an absolute tanty, convincing his brother to help lead a voyage to go and retrieve her. And the way he intended to do this was by evoking the oath of Tyndareus. So remember the thing that Odysseus came up with about protecting Helen's marriage and therefore her husband? Well, he should have just kept his mouth shut, because Menelaus is now hello, knocking on the doors of the kings, lords, warriors, and demigods of Greece, looking to cash in that chip. From Ithaca to Crete, Mycenae to Argos, Phthia to Salamis, and of course Sparta itself, Menelaus and Agamemnon assembled a massive force of Greeks known as the Achaeans. Okay, so we have all of the Greeks going up against all of Troy. So if that's kind of the origins, right, and those are the key states involved, who are the key players? So on the Greek side, as we said, we have Helen and Menelaus of Sparta, Agamemnon and his Mycenaean forces, Odysseus and the warriors of Ithaca, Ajax the Greater from Salamis, who was the great-grandson of Zeus, and Nestor, the king of Pylos, who was old, so couldn't fight, but he was basically like Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings. He's like an old wise force. There's also, of course, many other smaller figures we'll get into later, but those are the big Greek individuals for now, except for one. Oh yes, my divas, it is time to meet Greek's greatest warrior, Achilles. So he is the son of Peleus and Thetis, so the human and nymph wedding we spoke about, at the top, with the apple conundrum, that's his mum and dad, which makes Achilles a demigod, which, all well and good, Percy Jackson's a demigod, but why is Achilles so famous? Well, it actually comes down to his mum, who, being immortal herself, wanted her son to also live on forever, and as such, basically grabs him by the ankle, dips him in this immortal river as a baby, which submerged his entire body except for his ankle, which she was holding. If you're watching on video, yes, I am pretending like I'm holding baby Achilles. Therefore, making Achilles' heel his one point of weakness. Fun fact about him too is that he is widely interpreted by scholars as being queer, and is famously thought to have had a romantic relationship with Patroclus, his cousin, who also fought with the Greeks. So that is kind of the Achaean side, right? The Greeks. But what about the Trojans? So we already know about Paris, who was the son of King Priam and Queen Hecuba of Troy. But he did not have a normal princely upbringing, instead being cast out by his mother as a baby, as she had a dream that his birth would bring the end of Troy. Lots of dreams of destruction and oracles and visions throughout this. So as a result of this, he's kind of left for dead on a mountain, but this shepherd finds him and feels bad for him, so he raises him, totally unknown, that Paris was a prince, and also his mum and dad, like the actual king and queen, have no idea that he's alive until he wins a series of athletic competitions at a Trojan festival, which reveals his identity and kind of gets him welcomed back into the fold. While Paris may have been athletic, his skills as a warrior were mediocre, especially in comparison to his big brother Hector. Hector the Hottie is how I like to think about him. Now, he was heir to Troy's throne and a fearsome warrior who most describe as a good man who fought with honour. Next, we have their dad, King Priam, who, hold on to your hats here, people, apparently had upwards of 50 children, which included a few daughters, most notably Cassandra, the priestess of Apollo, who could tell the future, and we will get to that later. Now, during the war, Priam was an old man, but he was actually kind of nice and didn't blame Helen for leaving her husband and bringing, war to his shores because, after all, it wasn't her fault. Then lastly, on the Trojans' side, we have to mention Aeneas. Now, he was the son of Aphrodite and was largely considered to be the second best warrior for the Trojans after Hector, something which he did not like much, which, according to later tradition, saw him betray the Trojans. But again, we're all getting ahead of ourselves here because we still have to talk about the gods themselves. I mean, come on, divas. You didn't think the gods and goddesses who really are to blame for this whole thing were just going to butt out now? Of course not. Instead, they actually took opposing sides, which made the war all the more bloody. Or at least that's according to the Iliad, the epic poem written by Homer around the 8th century BCE, which details the events of the Trojan War, or, the lead up to and last year of the war at least. Now, we will get into a deeper analysis of Homer and the Iliad as a historical source at the end, but I do want to mention now that he wrote the Iliad 400 years after the events of the Trojan War are meant to take place. But still, for now, guys, we are all going to just treat what, he says in the Iliad as truth and bite our tongues on various nonsensical matters, including the fact that during the war, several of the gods are meant to have, come down to earth to intervene, with Hera, Poseidon, Hephaestus, and Athena favouring the Greeks. Meanwhile, Aphrodite, Apollo, and Ares took the side of the Trojans. So those are the key players. Now, let's go to war. So at this point, the Greeks gathered themselves into an armada consisting of over 1,000 ships and attempted to set sail for Troy across the Aegean Sea. However, there was a problem. Agamemnon had offended the goddess Artemis, who fucked up the winds to prevent the fleet from setting sail, which meant that before setting out for war, he had to sacrifice his own daughter. And I do mean sacrifice in the literal spilling of blood sense. So from the beginning, literally even before they have left for Troy, the Greeks are spilling innocent female blood. But with her sacrificed, Artemis fixed the winds and the armada sets off, finally arriving at the ancient city of Troy a few weeks later. Now, initially, upon their landing, the soldiers were a bit hesitant to disembark because, guess what? Another prophecy said that the first man to get out would be the first to die. One brave soul, Protesilaus, decided he didn't care and stepped ashore, but he really should have cared because guess what? He was the first to die when the Trojans, who obviously had had Helen for quite some time and were expecting, war, met the arriving forces on the beaches, where a battle broke out until eventually King Priam withdrew his troops back to the city. So the Greeks have landed and very quickly realised they could not simply march on Troy and expect this normal kind of swift victory that they'd had. For the city actually stood several kilometres inland on elevated ground, protected by massive limestone walls that, according to mythology, had been built generations earlier by Apollo and Poseidon to keep enemies out. Now, we still don't know, much of this story, whether the walls were literally divine or simply the finest fortifications of the late Bronze Age. But regardless of that, the fact remained. Troy could not be stormed in a single assault. So, what do the Greeks do? They dig in, establishing an enormous fortified camp along the shoreline, which is pretty much where they stayed for the next decade. Yeah. Sorry, guys, if you're expecting, a couple of month-long action-packed campaign that's easy to follow and progresses kind of day by day, that ain't what you're getting here. This was a long, drawn-out siege rather than a bloody battle. So we're going to keep to a timeline across the 10 years and cover all the parts that matters because literally otherwise we'd be here for 10 fucking years. So we're going to look at the major deaths, the battle tactics, and, obviously the end result. So these first few years, the Greeks dig in, like we said, and begin raiding settlements and villages around the city to cut Troy off from its resources, which is when Achilles really starts to flex his skills as a great warrior. Ancient tradition, particularly the lost epic Cypria, credits him with capturing 23 cities during the first 9 years of the war, which made him the spearhead of the Greek offensive and the nightmare of the Trojans. And I think it's important to note this here because while, the modern lens, especially through cinema, often portrays the Trojan War as these kind of like heroic duels between famed champions, much of the actual conflict was in devastating raids on ordinary communities, with homes being looted, temples stripped of valuable offerings, and women and children enslaved. Which brings us to Briseis. Now, after sacking the city of Lyrnessus, Achilles was awarded Briseis, a noblewoman allied with King Priam and the princes of Troy, as a war prize. Yeah, like a little prezi, because, humans are gifts. But that's actually not necessarily how Achilles viewed her, with Homer telling us that he loved her, quote, from his heart, despite having been, essentially gifted her. Which was commonplace during this time, with Agamemnon also taking a young noblewoman named Chryseis for his own spoils, something which would ultimately trigger the opening events of the Iliad, because Chryseis was the daughter of a respected priest of Apollo who struck down the Greek forces with a plague. In response to this, Agamemnon begrudgingly surrendered Chryseis, but not wanting to be without a prize, he takes Briseis from Achilles. This, as you can imagine, pisses off the famed demigod who flat out vows he will stop fighting for the cause, appealing to his mother Thetis, the nymph, to convince Zeus to keep the Trojans killing the Greeks. So like a full 180 against his own army, basically because Agamemnon took his girl. Like, these men, are we kidding? I cannot deal with how many lives are lost because they feel entitled to these women. It is fucking insane. Anyway, according to Homer, Zeus, who was supposed to be neutral in this war, but, for whatever reason agreed to kind of do this for Achilles, helps slaughter the Greeks. Like, really, properly slaughter them. As such, the Trojans take full advantage of this. Achilles is just kind of sulking in his tent during all of this time, which is when the first big face-off goes down. So, if you are like me and you live for the drama, right? The tea, the confrontation, this moment, this pinnacle, then you've been waiting for Menelaus and Paris to meet. Something which does eventually happen in the 10th year of the war. So what goes on then? How does this play out? Well, the scene is told to us in Book 3 of the Iliad and goes something like this. Menelaus and Paris decided that single combat would get all of this sorted, right? Very Jon Snow kind of philosophy here. With the two men agreeing to duel on the basis that the winner would get Helen, who is watching from the walls with the Trojan elders and King Priam. Now, despite Menelaus nor Paris being the greatest of warriors, Menelaus is absolutely whooping the young prince's ass during this, dragging him by his helmet until Aphrodite steps in, snatching Paris up and drawing him into the clouds, leaving this duel undecided, which, let me just say, if I were a spectator here, I'd be asking for a fucking refund, okay? I want a Gossip Girl Thanksgiving episode level spectacle, and I get a tie? Seriously. Like, give me some answers here. Let's end this war. 10 years, it's too long. But it doesn't end. It actually goes up a notch, for at the urging of Athena, a Trojan archer shoots Menelaus from the wall, wounding him and reigniting the fight, which resulted in the deaths of many Greeks. All the while, again, Achilles is just off in his tent crying over Briseis, something he would later regret, because one of the dead bodies that came out of the conflict was that of Patroclus. Now, we briefly mentioned him before, but he was Achilles' closest confidant, cousin, and potential lover, who was killed by none other than Hector, who mistook him for Achilles as he had been wearing the demigod's armor, which, FYI, is no ordinary armor here. It was gifted to Achilles by Hephaestus, the divine blacksmith, and had been, taken off Patroclus' body by Hector, who saw it as the ultimate trophy, although he soon realized when he's taken the helmet off, fuck, that's not Achilles, but, he didn't really care, and instead kept the armor, which the Greeks saw as a profound humiliation, and Achilles took very, very personally. He is, in no uncertain terms here, fucking fuming, and rejoins the cause with his mother getting Hephaestus to forge Achilles an entirely new suit of armor, the description of which occupies almost all of Book 18 in the Iliad, and is one of the most celebrated passages in ancient literature. So, I thought, because we're the podcast for the gals, let's do a bit of a fit check, right? What's the deal with this famed armor? So, first we have Thetis' appeal to Hephaestus, which she tells him, saying, quote, "My son is doomed to die young, and I cannot help him. Therefore I have come to you, if perhaps that you will be willing to make him a shield and helmet, a pair of goodly greaves fitted with ankle clasps, and a breastplate." So we are getting a full armor set, plus a helmet and a shield here. Of the shield, which was so incredibly impressive, definitely the armor's cute, but this is the centerpiece of it all. Homer tells us that it is made to represent the whole world, with celestial images depicting humans, the gods, the earth, the seas, the heavens, and more. Basically, a big, complete picture of the cosmos on this huge shield, which is described as a massive 5-layered work of metal and leather. As for the armor, Homer says it is, quote, "bright as blazing fire, so no man could look upon it," which is all given to Thetis, who, quote, "darted down from high Olympus like a falcon bearing the splendid armor for Achilles." So Achilles is not only, by this point, all fired up and furious by the death of Patroclus, but also decked out with this fancy pants new armor, and as such, sets off, driving the Trojans inside the walls of Troy, which is when he comes face to face with Hector. Okay, I'm liking it. Lots of confrontation. This is what we need. Again, imagine waiting 9 years for all of this one-on-one drama to unfold. I would not have the patience. I'd have gone home. Now, this is the point. For those of you who have seen 2004's Troy with Eric Bana and Brad Pitt, you will know this scene as the real pinnacle of the film, right? And in it, Hector kind of emerges from the gates of Troy very bravely, very honorably. He's alone to face off against Achilles, saying he had truly thought Patroclus was Achilles, and that whoever shall die between them will be treated with respect and given the relevant funerary proceedings. But that is not what happened. You see, in the Iliad, Hector was indeed the only man brave enough, or more so stupid enough, really, to meet an enraged Achilles, but once he saw him, he turned and ran. So much so that Achilles chased him around the citadel 3 times until Hector, probably exhausted from all this running, finally agreed to fight him. After this, it was over pretty quickly, with Achilles killing Hector, stripping him of his old armor, tying his feet behind his chariot, and then driving him around the city. This is obviously brutal in any case, but it doesn't just end there, because Achilles is so fucking mad, he keeps doing this for 12 days, leaving the Trojans and their king devastated, as it meant Hector would wander the underworld, never being at peace. So this guy's really is the proper rage of Achilles on full display here, and is ultimately considered so barbarous that even the gods become divided on how to proceed, with Apollo declaring that, quote, "Achilles has lost all pity." Meanwhile, Hera, Athena, and Poseidon, all kind of think it's fair game. They still hate Troy from the business with the apple. So it is now, only when Hector's been dragged around 12 times and all the gods are fighting, that Zeus finally decides to do his fucking job. Yeah? I honestly cannot with this man. I couldn't dislike Zeus more if I tried. So he decides after a decade, right, to step in, and he tells Thetis that she must speak to her son Achilles and get him to accept a ransom. Then he goes to the goddess Iris and tells her to go and speak with King Priam, instructing him to go to the Greek camp with money, which is where the film links back up with the text. Okay, guys, I just paused to check about the Priam pronunciation. Some sources say Priam, some say Priam. So I'm just going to keep saying Priam, okay? But you can feel free to call him whatever you want. Where were we? Okay. Hector's dead, the gods are intervening. This is a huge point in the story of the Trojan War because it is one of those rare moments where both sides really do recognize each other's humanity and, most importantly, like the gods behave as they actually should. So, as we said, Iris goes and speaks to Priam. I'm like wigging myself out now. Priam, and tells him to trust Zeus will protect him in bringing Hector's body back. But Hecuba, his wife, begs him not to go. She believes that he too will be killed. So Priam prays to Zeus for a sign that he will be safe, after which, at least according to Homer, a magnificent eagle appears on his right. Satisfied that Zeus is going to, grant him protection, this is a sign, Priam then sets off, guided by Hermes, who disguises himself as a young soldier and passes through the Greek camp, walking directly into Achilles' tent, where he kneels before him and, as Homer tells us, quote, kissed the hands that had slain so many of his sons. Achilles, of course, is astonished by this. He's slightly taken aback. This enemy king is like snuck in and he's in his tent, right? Which is when Priam delivers one of the most famous speeches in antiquity. Appealing to Achilles directly, he tells him, quote, I have endured what no other mortal on earth has ever done before. I put to my lips the hands of the man who killed my son. This act and Priam's willingness to die for the simple honor of burying his son breaks through Achilles' rage, and he himself starts crying before telling Priam, your son is given back, ordering for Hector's body to be washed and Priam to be fed before calling a 12-day truce for Hector's funeral procession. This would ultimately be the last truce before the final battle. This last moment of reflection, of compassion, and most importantly here, like I said, of humanity. After that, Priam places Hector's body on a wagon and takes him back to the city, escorted yet again by Hermes, which is where the Iliad ends, with the line, quote, such were the funeral rites of Hector, tamer of horses. Which really does reveal the truth about the Iliad here. Right? This isn't a source or a historical retelling of the Trojan War as a military campaign, right? But rather, it is the story of the wrath of Achilles, which Homer all but tells us in the very first line, saying, quote, sing, goddess, the anger of Achilles. And then, kind of ending here with the death of Hector, which becomes this kind of moral turning point for Achilles, with Priam's pain breaking his fury. Which, of course, then, guys, leaves the big question remaining. What the fuck happened next? And I am with you on this. Like, why write, Homer, I'm speaking to you directly, why write the story of this war without telling us the end result? Like, it's just stupid. Luckily for us, though, the Iliad is not the only source on the Trojan War. Instead, we have various, other things. There's pottery, there's weaponry, which depicts the events after Hector's death, alongside parts of other ancient poems now referred to as the epic cycle, which tell us more. So what do we think happened after, this kind of funeral rites of Hector, this kind of 12-day truce is over? Well, basically Achilles goes on another killing spree. Yeah. So it kind of turns out that, all this moral contemplation over Hector's death may have made him stop, like, desecrating bodies, but it doesn't mean he stops killing people. The first of whom is Penthesilea, queen of the Amazons, who arrives with an army of female warriors to aid Troy. Described as one of the greatest fighters of the age, she kills numerous Greeks before facing Achilles in single combat. He kills her after a bloody fight before having yet another pang of guilt, but not over the fact he'd killed her, but rather the fact she was hot and he'd killed her. In this tradition, it is said that after defeating Penthesilea, Achilles removed her helmet and began weeping after seeing how beautiful she was, something which the Greek soldier Thersites mocked Achilles for, resulting in his own death, which Achilles then had to go this, ritual purification for because it's bad juju to kill a fellow Greek and return to battle. Then, according to another source here, Troy's greatest ally finally arrives. Now, his name is Memnon, not to be confused with Agamemnon, and he's the king of Ethiopia, who arrives with this magnificent army. And, thanks to his own demigod status, he's considered an almost equal for Achilles in strength. This is going to be Troy's kind of great hope. But that wouldn't be the case, because guess what? Achilles also kills him. Yeah, this guy's just really good at killing. So, it ultimately at this point genuinely seems like no one and no thing can kill this motherfucker. Right, everyone he faces off with, Amazonian queens, demigod Ethiopian kings, are all dying at the end of his blade. But even Achilles has a weak spot. Remember when he was born and his mum, dips him in the river to make him immortal except for his ankle, which she's holding him by? Well, it turns out this would be his downfall. Having murdered all their allies, Achilles and the Greeks drove the Trojans back towards the city where Paris, the OG abductor, was waiting with a bow and arrow, which he fires towards Achilles' ankle, having been told this nifty little kind of weak spot by Aphrodite. Now, by itself, Paris's shot would probably not have killed Achilles, but he wasn't alone. Instead, Apollo, sick of all of Achilles' violence, helps guide the arrow to its mark, successfully embedding it into the one mortal part of his body. Although, we should note here, Homer never mentions an Achilles heel or a kind of mortal weakness, but this idea kind of comes later on, while these earlier sources just say Achilles dies by the arrow because Apollo directed the shot. So finally, Achilles, the greatest warrior in Greek history, the demigod, is dead. Right in front of the walls of Troy, where he himself had killed Hector, the two men really kind of mirroring each other in this moment. Right away, the Greeks are horrified, but they rally, with Ajax the Great defending his corpse while Odysseus fights off Trojan attackers as his body is dragged back to the Greek camp, where tensions break out amongst the men who, without their great warrior, are unsure how to proceed. You can't really blame them here, guys. After all, let us remember, this war's been going on for 10 years with very little progress. And unfortunately for the Greeks, the blows keep coming, for it's time to decide who gets Achilles' divine armor. Now, the two candidates here are Ajax the Great, who argues that he saved Achilles' body through physical strength, and Odysseus, who believes that his intelligence and leadership have saved the Greek army on multiple occasions now. For this reason, the armor is given to Odysseus, which drives Ajax into madness, literal psychosis, helped on by a bout of paranoia by Athena, which makes him slaughter livestock, believing they are his rivals. When he then regains his senses, he falls upon his own sword and dies from the dishonor. So within a few weeks here, guys, the Greeks have lost Achilles and Ajax and are now desperate. Oh, also, FYI, Paris is killed throughout this time, which makes the Trojans all the more angry. And now the Greeks, are fucking desperate for this win, right? Everybody's just rabid at this point. The kind of desperate where even the most harebrained idea has to be considered. And for this, Odysseus goes, well, what if we, take all this wood lying around, right? There's all this ruined wood here. And we build a giant hollowed out horse, which we then put inside of the walls of Troy. We hide inside, night falls, and we all jump out and fuck shit up. What do you guys think? Now, we listening today go, what the fuck kind of magic mushrooms are you on? But Agamemnon loved this idea. And so the horse was built by Appius, a skilled carpenter who ancient writers consistently identify as the craftsman responsible for its construction. And let me tell you, divas, this thing was fucking enormous, right? It was large enough to conceal around, estimates say, 30 to 50 Greek warriors. So really, really big. And this plan is all in motion. But the key thing is the Trojans have to believe the Greeks and their armada have left, right? This horse is like a gift. So Agamemnon and the rest of the fleet all board their ships and sail behind the nearby island of Tenedos to hide while one Greek soldier named Sinon stayed behind, having himself captured and telling Priam and the Trojans they, had made this horse in reverence to Athena, who they'd pissed off, all fake, and as such, the horse was sacred, with Sinon claiming that if the Trojans destroyed it, they too would offend the goddess. And this is like when red flags should, be considered. While some, including Priam's daughter Cassandra, distrusted the gift and tried to warn the Trojans, they refused to listen, instead pulling the giant horse into the city amid singing, feasting, and sacrifice. So Odysseus, right, he's pulled this thing off, and after darkness fell, Sinon emerged, released the Greek warriors inside, and lit a signal fire for Agamemnon, who returned with the Greek fleet to take the city. What then followed was one of the bloodiest episodes in Greek history, guys, spreading throughout the city. The Greeks are brutal. They set buildings alight. They kill anyone who resisted. Priam, right, the king, he's slain. Menelaus found Helen. He's about to kill her, but he sees her beauty and then he kind of realizes he can't, so he grabs her and takes her back. Cassandra, right, she's dragged out of the temple. Hector's young son is thrown from the walls of Troy to prevent him from one day avenging his family. Meanwhile, his mum and grandmum are all taken captive. And by dawnbreak, the greatest city of the Bronze Age lay in ruins, and the Greeks had won. So that's the end of the Trojan War conflict. And while we're going to deep dive what happened next, kind of next week in the Odyssey, which is the sequel, we kind of know Odysseus, Helen, Agamemnon, Menelaus, Hector's wife, they're all alive. And we will, like I said, go through what happens next week to them. So that's the conflict, right? But the big question, the one thing we've all been biting our tongue not to bring up is the Trojan War real? Right? Big wooden horses, demigods, real gods, oracles, Helen, magical arrows. Did any of this actually happen? So let's put on our Sherlock Holmes hats, okay, and first look at the facts, starting with Homer himself. Now, the thing to note about Homer, above all else, is that he is not a historian, and rather a poet/writer living in Athens around the 8th century BCE, which means that by the time he's writing about the Trojan War, 400 years have passed from the 1200 to 1250 BCE date. So that's like a long period of time, right? Where stories can be changed and exaggerated and forgotten. Or, in probably most cases here, just made up, which author Peter Jones points out would be impossible not to happen because oral history was Homer's primary source. Herodotus, largely dubbed the father of history, whose work in the 5th century BCE is considered the first historical work, also makes a really good point about the reality behind the Iliad, saying that no king in real life would ever allow his city to be sacked and his children killed because his wayward son came home with a foreign woman. Which, guys, let's be so fucking for real, is 1000% true. He would have kicked them both to the curb. Plus, who can forget the start of the war is because Zeus was too lazy to judge a beauty contest between 3 goddesses, and the central figure of the narrative here is Achilles, a demigod, who dies by being shot with a magical arrow in the ankle. Now, if you're a follower of ancient Greek religion, I don't want to diss your gods here, but I think the vast majority of us look at the use of the divine in the Iliad as, 1, a tool to up the ante, and 2, something to explore themes of fate, mortality, empathy, and ultimately the cost of anger, rather than anything that's based in reality. Which leads us to believe that Homer used the story of the Trojan War in the Iliad as a device to make philosophical inquiry, not to recount history, which is something we saw a couple of weeks back when we were talking about Plato and Atlantis, right? Plato's not a historian, and most likely told the tale of Atlantis to make similar commentary around the fall of man. So this is something that is common kind of for the ancient world. But, because there's always a but when doing proper historical inquiry, guys, much like the Atlantis example, just because the Trojan War may be used by Homer as a device doesn't mean it wasn't based on a real conflict. So, what evidence, what fact, what archaeology do we then have that can help us answer the question, did the Trojan War happen? Well, first, let's start with the big one, right? The easiest way to answer this question is to find evidence of the city of Troy itself, right? The structures. So, what do we know about it then? Well, ancient Troy was believed to be located in an area called the Troad in the northwest corner of modern day Turkey, a spot which was close to the Dardanelles, making it perfect for both trade and defense. It was also a fertile land and incredibly beautiful, something which has continued to attract travelers and pilgrims who want to admire the landscape and, of course, try and walk in the footsteps of the Trojan heroes. But by the time the field of archaeology began to take shape in the 19th century, many were skeptical of ever finding this city. Frank Calvert, however, was not one of these people. Having accompanied his brother Frederick on a diplomatic mission to the northwest Anatolian region of Çanakkale, Frank noticed similarities to what Homer described as Agamemnon's Greek encampment in the mouth of the Scamander River. And it is here that he met journalist and geologist Charles McLaren. Determined to find the Trojan city, the pair launched an investigation into claims made by locals that ancient Troy might have stood on one of the surrounding hilltops around this river. And after taking a detailed topographical study of the area, they found a 32-meter mound known as Hisarlik, the Turkish word for fortress, which matched this theory. So, in 1847, Calvert bought Hisarlik, but before he could explore any further, the Crimean War broke out, which paused his efforts and put a big dent in the bank account, which is when wealthy German businessman and amateur archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann came into the picture. At Calvin's invitation, Schliemann visited Hisarlik in 1868 and decided to excavate, tearing massive trenches all the way down the base of the hill, where he uncovered a hoard of precious artifacts, jewelry, and metalwork, including 2 diadems dubbed the Jewels of Helen, which Schliemann took full credit for and announces to the world he's, found Troy and the treasures of its king Priam. According to his published accounts of the find, he noticed something glinting in the excavation trench, and fearing the Ottoman officials or workmen present might interfere, he sent them home for the day while his wife Sophia carefully removed the treasure, wrapping them in her shawl and secretly carrying it all away, which, very dramatic, right? Very secretive and fantastical, but just wasn't true. In fact, Sophia wasn't even there, instead being in Athens attending to family members after her father's death, which left the question, if he'd lied about that, did he lie about the treasure being Priam's and the city being Troy? Well, yes, but also no. Modern archaeology today has shown that the treasure came from the layer of Hisarlik known as Troy II, a settlement dated to roughly 2500 to 2300 BCE, which means it cannot belong to the Trojan War era, as this was set around 1200 to 1250 BCE. So his find was not Priam's gold, it was actually nearly 1,000 years older. So still incredible, right? But not what he said it was. So what about the city then? Well, it is hard to know for certain, but modern archaeologists say that yes, Schliemann did discover the real ancient city of Troy. But it's kind of complicated, so let's break it down. Leslie Filton and Alexander Villing, curators at the British Museum, believe Troy was first settled in the early Bronze Age, right? So around 3000 BCE. So while the war is, like we said, 1200, 1250, the city predates that by a lot. So much so that this early version of Troy even predates the construction of the first Egyptian pyramids in 2780 BCE. So we are talking about proper ancient history, right? And this layer is known as Troy I. Now, as is the case with all ancient cities, fires, earthquakes, battles, new development, right, have caused rebuilding over existing structures. Like Rome, for example, whenever they, try and put a new building or subway or something, they got to stop because they find a temple or mosaics or whatever it is. It's the same thing with Troy. And when Schliemann was digging frantically looking for the Trojan War layer and, the gold, he blasts this big hole through all of these different layers that are stacked on top of each other, which made it really hard to determine the various eras, but we have now managed to do so with modern technology. So, as I said, early Bronze Age, where, Troy is just this kind of small but flourishing village, is Troy 1. Then we have the mid Bronze Age around 2550, 2300 BCE, where it's kind of this larger citadel. It's built behind these kind of walls. Again, this is Troy 2, where Schliemann found the treasure hoard. Then we have Troy 3, which is dated to 2300 to 2200 BCE, which tells us at some point during those 100 years, the city was burned and rebuilt. Then we have Troy 4, another rebuilding phase, which leads to Troy 5, where prosperity begins to return to the region and the city expands. And then we have Troy 6, from 1750 to 1300 BCE, by which stage Troy is a huge Bronze Age city. Okay, it is fit out with these massive limestone defensive walls. They're up to 8 meters high. It's got towers and gateways and citadels. You name it. This layer of Hyssalic reflects the scale and stature of the city that Homer wrote about. So from this evidence, the real, definitive archaeological proof, we know that Troy was a real city, and there are parallels with what Homer says about it. So how do we then confirm the next stage of that, right? That a war actually happened. Well, for that, we go to the next layer. So Troy 7a, which is dated to around 1250 BCE, right? Our bingo kind of year for the Trojan War, where we do see evidence of some kind of disaster happening around this time. Whether it was natural, like an earthquake, or man-made, like a war, the result was inhabitants rebuilding directly on the ruins of Troy 6, where people squeezed, smaller houses into available spaces. We also have large storage jars hidden under floors, which suggest kind of food shortages. There's human skeletons within destruction layers, there is damaged defensive walls, and there are arrowheads everywhere, all of which suggests the city was preparing for siege, which many historians see as a striking parallel to Homer's account. Something that becomes even clearer if we look at Troy 7b, so the next layer, which reveals new inhabitants to the city with different styled pottery, architectural techniques, and genetic remains, all of which point to the city's inhabitants in Troy 6 and Troy 7a either being wiped out or just leaving. So again, the archaeology tells us some kind of conflict or disaster has happened to late Bronze Age Troy. So there's a tick, right? Troy is real, a conflict happened there. But carrying on our Sherlock Holmes investigation here, how do we then know that this war, right, the evidence from this conflict, was with the Greeks? Well, for this, we look at Troy through a different light as part of the Hittite Empire of Anatolia, which was the larger region around the city, right? So if you look at like Rome, the city versus Rome, the empire. Here, we have a pretty invaluable source known as the Hittite tablets, which make mention of the Hittite Empire fighting for the people ruled by Alexandros. Now, Alexandros is another name for Prince Paris. So we're already kind of starting to connect the dots here, but let's be real, we're still not convinced. So let's look at our next source, which is the Treaty of Alexandria, which notes that the Hittites would ensure allied troops for the conflict in a timely manner in exchange for protection against the Mycenaes. So again, we are seeing some real proper credence here to the idea that the people of Troy and its surrounding regions fought against, if not all of Greece, I think we can probably say that's an exaggeration, right? If not all of Greece, at least the Mycenaeans, which leads us to the last question that needs to be answered. If the city of Troy is real and the conflict did happen, then did it go down like Homer tells us? The answer to which is almost certainly no. Again, even if we strike out the divine here, by which, Helen is hit by a love arrow, Achilles is a demigod, Aphrodite's being a menace and kind of more, we're still left with the idea that all of the leaders of the Greek states upped and left their homes and their families and their people and went to war with Troy over a woman. I mean, you just have to say Helen of Troy, and the one thing people know, the most famous quote from the whole entire saga is that she had the face that launched 1,000 ships. Which, is amazing storytelling. That's why we remember it now. But even if she were Daenerys or Megan Fox or the living embodiment of Aphrodite herself, these kings and lords and chiefs would not have gone to war over her. And more than that, guys, she wasn't even fucking real. Yeah, there is zero historical evidence to suggest Helen of Sparta was a real living, breathing woman, with historian Dr. Bettany Hughes telling us that Homer likely created her off the back of stories where the infidelity of other high-ranking women during the Bronze Age sparked threats of war between states. So basically, Homer has created a, semi-divine woman who was so beautiful and sexualized and irresistible because he heard some rumors about ancient affairs and thought, that's a good story. And the reason he thought that is because it is the story, right? Old as time, repeated throughout the centuries, the banner call of men's rights groups and incels alike. Man's one great weakness is sex. I mean, come on. Paris couldn't help himself more than that, actually. Aphrodite, right, the living embodiment of pleasure and temptation, told Paris that Helen belonged to him. He's not abducting her, he's just claiming what's his. And that is something that all of those other Greek kings and lords and people reading the Iliad understand. Because at the end of the day, female sexuality and Helen, as this kind of living embodiment of that, is their greatest weakness, and therefore the greatest danger to peace. Again, Bettany Hughes backs this up, saying that, quote, Homer was not composing a history, but a myth, which didn't mean pure fantasy, rather things that were spoken of over time, which in the case of Helen and, the danger her sexuality presents, it's all just a byproduct of patriarchy, which existed long before Homer, making it relevant for him to create her as a central figure in his story because ultimately it was something that people of his time understood. And the scary reality today is that it's still very relevant now. As for the rest of the conflict, we know from the archaeological evidence there was a war or disaster which took down the great city of Troy. Plus, let's be honest here, right? Oral tradition, while it can't be trusted, does always come from somewhere. So wouldn't it then make sense then? Again, this is my Sherlock, delivery for you guys. The case is closed. Doesn't it make sense that Homer's heard one of these tales of the Great War at Troy, added, a bit of GST, right? By bringing in, all of the Greek forces, not just the Mycenaeans, and demigods and real gods for this bit of, extra dramatic flair. Plus, just on logistics here for a minute, this war was said to go for 10 years, which Dr. Bettany Hughes also says seems to be, from the archaeology, total nonsense. Daisy Dunn, a British classicist, also says that a war lasting 10 years when the citadel was so compact is highly, highly unlikely. So again, some fabulous kind of mayonnaise and GST being added here, which leaves the last fun question to answer. I actually like this one. The Trojan horse. Right? The brilliant idea of Odysseus to smuggle the Greeks into the city. Was it real? Well, Cornell University says most scholars nowadays believe the Trojan horse may have existed as a siege weapon, which were basically these huge wooden structures which could be slammed against the fortification. If you've seen Gladiator 2, the kind of opening sequence is a perfect example of this. But things get a bit more complicated when we think of the horse being used in the way Homer tells us, to conceal and transport men. First of all, guys, there is no doubt here, it doesn't even come into the equation, that the Greeks were capable of making the horse. In fact, skilled woodwork was one of their greatest strengths, producing large seagoing ships capable of crossing the Aegean, complex chariots, and massive timber-roofed palaces at Mycenae, Turnus, and Pylos, all of which prove their capabilities. So if that's not the issue, then it has to be size, right? After all, the Trojan horse is estimated to be around 8 to 10 meters high and 6 to 8 meters long in order to fit the 30 to 50 men inside. So was this possible? Again, yes. By 1250 BCE, the Greeks were already building ships around 25 to 35 meters long, making the horse significantly smaller than one of their largest ships. So if the challenge isn't construction, then what is it? Well, it ultimately comes down to what any good plan kind of rests on, right? Logistics. I mean, think about it. Firstly, how are you going to design the horse so the, call it 40-ish men inside don't crash each other? And then how are you going to accommodate for heat, lack of oxygen, thirst, muscle cramping, and, like accidental noise? That's what I always think. I'm like, how are these guys staying quiet? But playing devil's advocate here, let's just say you do all of that, right? You still then have to move this thing into the city. After all, even conservatively, historians estimate a timber structure of that size could easily weigh 10 to 20 tons or more, depending on its design. So can you get it inside? Well, technically, yes. I mean, the Egyptians transported much larger stone blocks for the pyramids centuries earlier, but this isn't Egypt with a booming population and skilled workers. This is Troy, ravaged by war and death. And this kind of task would still require hundreds of people pulling simultaneously with rollers and ropes. And that's before you get to the city gates, which archaeological evidence of Troy 6 and 7a tell us they were only large enough for carts and wagons. And while, yes, Virgil does tell us the Trojans got the horse inside by breaking down parts of the wall, that is a hell of a thing to bet on. Because it would essentially require, like, the Trojans to believe, one, the Greeks had truly departed, two, ignore or dismiss suspicion and all these red flags by people like Cassandra and others, which we already spoke about, three, bring an enormous object into the city by breaking down their walls, the things that defended them, four, leave it unguarded overnight, and five, kind of fail to detect, the soldiers inside who, again, heat, oxygen, design, like they can't be staying quiet. So while it may be physically possible for the Trojan horse to have been built and used as Homer describes, it requires an almost divine sequence of pretty implausible events to happen one after the other. And even though we have extremely old depictions of the Trojan horse, like on the famous Mykonos vase, dated to around 675 BCE, these pieces merely confirm the legends, which, were already buzzing around the archaic period rather than any factual event. So it was wonderful, as the Trojan horse idea is. Most archaeologists and ancient historians agree that it's more likely the Greeks built a much smaller horse as a religious offering, or built a large wooden structure as a battering ram, rather than a disguise for Troy's ultimate fall, as Odysseus planned and as Homer describes. So let's recap. It's a big episode, guys. I know there's so many moving parts here, but let's put this baby to bed. Most historians believe that Troy was a real Bronze Age city that experienced conflicts and destructions around 1250 BCE and most likely involved the Mycenaeans and Troy, right? We've got evidence to support that. Homer's Iliad, as such, isn't a history, but a story shaped over generations by oral retellings of an ancient conflict at the city of Troy, which he, along with a number of other important Greek scholars and playwrights, fluffed up, cut some bits out of, and put their own spin on to make it grander and more relevant to the Greek values of their own time. Which means there is no single complete source which we can refer to in order to understand the whole story or confirm whether it ever really happened. So, the most authoritative source we then have on the Trojan War is the archaeology at Hisarlik, which reveals a city of great prosperity that declined after a disaster, which makes sense for it to be the inspiration for Homer's Iliad, which blended Bronze Age warfare with legends of gods, narrative skills, and a good old sprinkle of whimsy, fake horses, and drama, which was invented and spread for the pleasure of the reader and as a philosophical insight into mankind, which is, exactly why so many people across so many centuries have clung to it. Inspired by the fury and the fantasy of a world that feels long gone, but perhaps in reality isn't too far from where we currently are. Which brings us to the end of another episode of Hot History, guys. Thank you so much for following along with me on this episode. I know it's been a lot of, long Greek words, and I'm probably cannibalizing them all. And again, I apologize, but, I'm glad we're able to set this base of what the Trojan War is, who is involved, because next week, like I said, we are going to talk about the Odyssey. It will line up with the release of the film, and we'll kind of see where this kind of fallout lands. What's going on? Will Odysseus make it home? As always, guys, if you are looking for some more Hot History before then you can follow us on Instagram at Hot History Club and on TikTok at hot.history. It has been such a pleasure getting down and dirty in time with you, and I will speak to you all shortly. Thanks, guys. Love you. Bye.